Eric, why did you send her away? You desired her, and she was yours to use exactly as you pleased. Why risk offending the Shah for the sake of a girl who was only a slave? He gave a great cry of rage, lifted the table in front of him, and threw it across the room with a force that splintered the legs asunder from the marble top. Only a slave, only an animal. He roared, "You asinine Persian dolt! Get out of me way, quickly, before I forget all that I you. Is this another of your quaint and delightful customs?" he demanded furiously. "Has no one in this God-forsaken court heard of a decent period of mourning?" I raised my shoulders helplessly. The Shah's sister is his personal property to be disposed of as he sees fit. Eric looked at me incredulously. "Are you telling me the girl is transferable? Like the Grand Vizier's signet ring that whoever takes one must take the other?" I sighed. "It is often the custom in such matters." "Oh, I see," he said contemptuously. "Legalized rape is the done thing here, is it? Any man may force himself upon a woman and say it is the custom. My God, what a country!" And he turned away with such fierce disgust that I felt faintly ashamed of my own race. She is poor and has children to feed. I am able to pay the price she asks without hardship. Why should I stand here and haggle with her like a miser? She expects it, Eric. I tell you it is the custom. Fuck your customs. There is something intrinsic in human nature that when someone says, "This thing belongs to us, not you, and no, you can't have it," the excluded group loses their shit, whether they actually would have wanted the thing or not. Like, I did want to go to Shelley's birthday party. I don't even like Shelley, but I find out that I am not invited. Oh, that bitch. This attitude dominates discussions of cultural appropriation in particular, where one group says, "No, this thing belongs to us and actually has deep cultural and religious significance that you clearly do not understand, nor do you care to, so maybe don't wear a feather headdress as part of your lingerie line." Like, maybe the excluded group has zero interest in wearing a feather headdress with a lingerie line, but they kind of offended at the idea that someone said you can't. Why can't I do sexy feather headdress? I didn't steal your land or violate countless treaties or give you diseases to which you had no natural immunity. I personally was not there. And no, I wasn't going to wear a sexy feather headdress, but I should be able to without being called problematic. But this attitude is nothing new. Let us go back to the mid-19th century, when travel writing was all the rage and there was particular interest in the Orient. And I don't mean that Orient, although that was certainly also a thing, but in this case, Egypt, the Ottoman Empire, and Persia. It is from male European travelers to the Ottoman Empire that Europe was introduced to the idea of the harem, but only the idea, because men weren't allowed into harems. See, that's kind of the whole point. Only woman and male relatives are allowed into harems. Them's the rules. And of course our 19th century Eurotrash did not like that. Why won't you let me into your club filled with slave ladies wearing those sexy belly dancer outfits and those finger symbol thingies and those Baetis eunuchs with their sabers? Why can I not have the ring? And with this desire to be included in a space in which they were not allowed, their presumptions about the culture they were visiting combined with this forbidden space made their imaginations run wild. If we aren't allowed in there, it must be because it's sexy. Licentious. It must be full of these sexy slave babes who don't really want it, but also kinda want it. These are some early mainstream European examples of what Columbia University professor of literature Edward Said defined as Orientalism in his 1978 book, Orientalism. European depictions of the Middle East date as far back as the medieval period, the Crusades, a thing that happened. But the rise of what we all call Orientalist media really begins in the 18th century as major European world powers go into war with the Ottoman Empire. Operas like Mozart's Abduction from the Seraglio, travelogues like Lady Elizabeth Craven's A Journey Through Crimea to Constantinople, and Lord Byron's poetry/personal antics were all popular proliferators concept of the Eastern other. But where 19th century Orientalism really took off in the visual and language arts coincided with Napoleon's failed attempts to invade Syria and Egypt, and the British Empire's efforts to destabilize the Ottoman Empire at the beginning of the 19th century. As both world powers sought to colonize these areas, demand back home created an explosion of art centered around the Middle East and Central Asia, often by artists who had never actually been to said territories, but they had like a friend who knew someone whose cousin had done like one of those Nile cruises. And as a result, we got art that looks something like this. Slave babes, but for your average Jack and Jack back in Mother's England and France, this emerging visual culture dominated perceptions of these countries. No, paintings like this were not based in reality. Yikes. But Victorian Europeans thought that they were. It's like if aliens tried to make art depicting what being an American in 2019 is like, but only having like Nickelback as a reference. But they've never actually seen Nickelback. They've only like heard about them second or third hand, and maybe they've seen like the photograph meme. Eventually, travel writing by European women became a thing and tried to clear up this incorrect assessment of what harem life was like because being women, they were allowed into harems. Turns out harem life is actually pretty boring. And no, they don't dress like that. And no, that's not what an odalisque is, Susan. I'm not saying it was a good social order. I'm just saying it was nothing like the sexy licentious slave babes that these dudes imagined it to be. But the damage was done. But the damage was done. And to this day, when you hear the word harem in the Occident, it conjures up a very specific, very 19th century image. Sexualized, licentious, appropriative, and above all, inaccurate. But who cares? It's just media. It's just writing. It's just a painting. It doesn't have any real world consequences. And besides, they do it to us too. Watch any movie designed for non-American audiences that features an American character and it's like, oh, so that's what that's like. And of course that is true, but it is completely disingenuous to say that Orientalist depictions of the Middle East had no real-world consequences in terms of real-world politics. Categorically, it did. Just within the last year, German far-right and totally not neo-Nazi group AfD, anglicized as Alternative for Germany, used one of the more notorious Orientalist paintings, Jean Leon Gérôme's The Slave Market, as part of a propaganda campaign against Syrian refugees being allowed entry into Germany. But other less overt examples pervade mainstream media as well. 300 is hilarious, but kind of also an insidious depiction of a war between the East and the West. And more recently we have the post-9/11 gritty realism trend of films set in the Middle East, but we're not getting into that today. So we gotta colonize the motherfuckers, US. This is the rationale behind colonization in general. Like, yeah, we want their stuff, but really we redoing them a favor by colonizing them. I mean, look at them. It's for their own good. They all need Jesus. And they've got this crescent moon. That's not a cross. And they got this club they want let us into, and I don't like it. And while neither Egypt, the Ottoman Empire, nor Persia were ever technically colonies, some of their stuff was. And their historical trajectories were all deeply impacted by the effects of colonialism, the consequences of which haunt us to this day. Now we know what you rethinking. We re-like 10 minutes into this video and you re-like, this is not what I was promised by the thumbnail. I was promised 80s melodramatic rock opera, and I'm getting to that. But the backdrop of Orientalism is important to this discussion. If you've never read Gaston Leroux's 1910 novel, The Phantom of the Opera, you probably don't know where I am going with this. But if you have read it, you totally know where I am going with this. Enter the Persian, one of the main characters in Gaston Leroux's own of Phantom of the Opera, a fan favorite, a character so central to the narrative that basically the entire second half is told from his point of view, and a character that is either whitewashed, altered, or omitted entirely from the vast majority of the hundreds of adaptations of Phantom of the Opera. Like nearly all of them. Nearly, fairly, all. Like at least 95. And on the rare occasion when he's not cut out, we get you assonant Persian dolt. The one well-known-ish adaptation, or in this case, retelling, that does feature the Persian in any role of prominence is Susan Kaye's 1990 novel titled Only Phantom, which falls squarely into the worst flavors of 1980s Atala, Asahala, anti-Iranian sentiment combined with good old-fashioned 19th century Orientalism, which legalized rape is the done thing here, is it? Any man may force himself upon a woman and say it is the custom. This book is also extremely popular with a fandom, and incidentally is not available on Audible. And there was a time when Phantom fandom had no goddamn sense of humor and you were not allowed to criticize this book. But it's 2020. Phantom shitposting is finally a thing, and I am the god. But we'll get to that book. First, let's take a look at the source material. Who is this Persian? What is his function within the novel? And why is he omitted from nearly every single one of the shit-million adaptations of Phantom of the Opera? Gaston Leroux's novel is not all that dissimilar from either the 1925 Lon Chaney movie or Andrew Lloyd Webber's musical, or even its terrible film adaptation directed by Joel Schumacher. The key difference is the novel was originally published in serial form and framed more as a mystery instead of a tragic romance with new increments of the story introduced each week. Who is doing the bad thing? Could it be the manager? Could it be the rat catcher? Could it be the Vicomte de Chagny's older brother Philip? Could it be this shady ethnic in the Estracan cap that's always running around the opera? Or could it be the skull-faced incel who lives in the basement? Who's to say? I'm going to summarize the original novel, and yes, it does spoil the whole thing, so spoilers for Phantom of the Opera. Our story begins when the prima donna Larcolada falls ill, and is replaced by this young ingenue no one's ever heard of named Kristen Day, and she brings the house down with how amazing she is. During her performance she is recognized by her childhood friend, the fuckboy Vicomte Raoul de Chagny, and he goes to her dressing room to say, "Hey, good job," but he overhears her talking to this guy who claims to be her voice teacher, and being a fuckboy he's like, "Oh, slut." In the meanwhile there's all these mysterious goings-on. Someone calling themselves the opera host is extorting the new managers, some gunka turns up dead with the news around his neck, there's this shady brown fellow poking around the opera all the time, and amidst it all, Kristin just disappears. And of course the fuckboy is like, slut. Couple weeks later there's a masquerade, and hey, she's back, and she pulls Raoul aside and tells him where she's been, and of course the victim-blaming fuckboy is like, slut. And she's like, no, what do I have to explain to you? That I was kidnapped by a skull-faced incel named Eric, who, well, admittedly, he told me he see so. I mean, he said sees you, they were use and view, illuminally, I don't know if you do, you see you do, but do you, go you do, go you do so, delusion do you, the said you do, go you see, go you. See you do. See you. That is you do. Then do less you do. See you do. See you do. See you do. This is you. You do. You do. Basically, she pulls that act off long enough for Eric to let her out of the basement so she can tell the victim-blaming fuckboy, "Oh, please, God help 'em." And he's like, "Okay, how about we leave together after your next big performance?" So after the next big performance, Kristin just disappears right off the stage, like right in the middle of the stage. And if we re-watching the musical, this would be the track down this murderer portion that leads into the final lair scene, but we re only about halfway through the book. Enter the Persian. He's never given a name because the framing device is Laru telling the story like he's a journalist presenting it almost like found footage, like it really happened, and since in universe the Persian isn't on great terms with the shy, he's trying to protect this guy's identity. In terms of Gilded Age literature, at which Laru's original novel falls right at the tail end, the Persian is an interesting character because, in most regards, he does not fall within late Victorian Orientalist tropes, like the tragic backstory stuff totally does. When the narrative goes back to Eric's time in Persia when they first got to know each other, it definitely does those exotic Orients, they love their blood sport. The royals watch murder just for fun, just like the Romans, so barbaric. See, Eric moved to Persia to be like a circus performer/architect, and while he was here, he made all this amazing architecture for the Shah. This was also where he learned to do murder real good. That's the Punjab lasso that is very clumsily handled in the musical and even more clumsily in the film somehow. It's a sneaky foreign way to kill. He insta-garrots you and you never see it coming, and the Shah loved watching Eric do this. He thought it was great. Well, anyway, the Shah liked Eric, but Eric knew too much, so he has Todi, Igus, and the Persian, who has a soft spot for Eric, helped him escape and basically covered for him. The Shah suspected the Persian did this, but lacking proof, and since the Persian is like his fifth cousin or something, banished him from court instead of killing him, and he also gave him a nice pension. And so, in his new life in Paris, the Persian basically spends all his time keeping an eye on Eric and making sure he didn't do too many murders, and Eric pays him back by not murdering him when he happens to venture too close to his underground lair. So Laroux's depiction of Persia in the 1850s, when Eric and the Persian met, fell right into that orientalist trope of barbaric, exotic, and feminine Orient. But the character himself is kind of ahead of his time in that, in a narrative that centers mostly white people, he has a character at all. He isn't exoticized, except insofar as everyone thinks he's kinda shady before they get to know him. He is barbaric, he doesn't shroud himself in mysticism, and his otherness is not at all used to set him apart from the rest of the characters. He is arguably the most well-rounded character in the book, and easily the most likable. And he doesn't TD. So basically Raoul goes into the basement to rescue Christine, but gets circumvented by the Persian, who's like, "Hey dude, you are going to die in like half a second if I don't help you." Raoul, understandably suspicious, is like, "Who are you? How do you know all this?" And the Persian is like, "Look, Eric and I basically went to college together. He did me a solid and I did him a solid, but I also got booted out of Persia because of this ashol. So now I'm wasting me golden years cleaning up at the to Kyle I said do you show you I said I should I know you show you show all you show you show you show They make it all the way down to Eric's house by the lake under the opera, but then, oops, accidentally end up in the torture chamber he has in his house. For some reason. So that's okay, sure. Eric doesn't even notice that they were there at first, because he's too busy Christine an ultimatum that she either has to marry him or he's going to blow up the opera house. She finds out the Persian and Raoul are in there, and in short order Eric does too, and he turns the torture chamber on. It's basically a sauna. Eventually Christine is like, okay, I'll marry you. Just please let these guys go. And Eric is like, okay, and he does, and the Persian wakes up in his home like nothing had happened. So by this point the Persian is like, you know what? I have covered for this ashol for way too long. I don't care what I owe him. I have paid my debt to his ass. I'm going to the police and I'm telling them everything. And just as he's about to do that, knock knock, Hughes, who's at the door. It's Eric. And he plops down on the Persian chaise lounge and he's like, "Hey, bud, I'm sorry about all that. Oh, I let her go. Um, as far as I know she's going to elope with Raul. Are we cool?" And the Persian is like, "Dude, what the fuck?" When Kristen agrees to marry him, Eric in his infinite crazy assumes that she is totally playing him and has every intention of killing herself rather than being his wife because he is just the worst. Which he is. But as in the musical, she kisses him and he realizes like, holy shit, she's actually willing to go through with this. It is at this point that he concedes to himself how horrible he's been and is so overcome with emotion that he lets her go, gives her his blessing, and makes her promise that she'll come back and bury him once Hades of all this love he's feeling, which given that we've still got some Victorian vapors going on, should be in a couple weeks or so. Eric relates all this to the Persian, who relates it to the narrator, LaRue. Eric presumably does D. Kristen presumably does come back to bury him, and the Persian D's an old man, safe and happy in his home in Paris. The end. So with regard to the most famous Phantom adaptation, in terms of pure plot utility, you probably recognize the character of the Persian in the character of Madame Curie. She kind of floats around, warns people about stuff, and then when the time comes, she's the one who shows Raoul how to get down to the lair and how to protect himself against the Punjab lasso. Hell, in the film version, she's even involved in the tragic backstory and helps him escape the thing, both traits from the Persian in the original novel. I'm not saying Andrew Lloyd Webber is bad for replacing the Persian with a white woman. He's bad for other reasons. But little-known fact about Andrew Lloyd Webber's Phantom of the Opera is that the original plan was not to write an original musical, but to produce Ken Hill's 1976 adaptation of Phantom of the Opera, who's extremely close to LaRue's book and does feature the Persian as a major supporting character. In fairness, this musical is just really genuinely terrible. And I can't say they made the wrong choice by deciding to co-star Ken Hill and then just writing their own. But it must needs be remarked, but one of the major changes that they made from the Ken Hill musical, itself the inspiration for the current Broadway behemoth, is that it cuts out the Persian. The closest thing that could be considered a reference, either to the character or Eric's time in Persia, is this here monkey, which Amin and I've seen this show like 400 times and I've still don't know what they were going for with the monkey. And this falls within the trend of adaptations not only cutting the character out, but leaving in a replacement role, basically conceding that some character performing the Persian's role in the story, at least if you keep it, as long as they rewrite. Well, this began with the first big adaptation, Carl Laemmle's 1925 feature film The Phantom of the Opera starring Lon Chaney. The Persian is in this movie. He's got his Astrakhan cap and everything, only he's not actually here. This is not Persian at all, but a French white police inspector named Ledox, who's pretending to be Persian for reasons. And he's been tracking that phantom for months, in disguise. And now he's found him, but instead of involving the police, for whom he works, instead he just takes Raoul for some reason. You can probably guess why. Yep, tale as old as film. The earlier cuts of the film originally hewed way closer to the novel. That Astrakhan cap is there because in the original cut, Ledoq was the Persian. Even his casting choice is somewhat telling. Ledoq's actor, Arthur Ibn Karo, was actually born in Armenia and was a character actor known for playing shady foreigners, such that he rarely got to play a good guy as he does in this movie. Such as they, 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 And it also had the novel's ending, with Eric letting Christine go instead of being eaten alive by an angry mom. Whiz. So they shot it, and then they changed it, and the Persian was a secret white the whole time. And that trend did not exist in a vacuum either. This follows Paramount's 1921 hit The Sheik, starring Rudolph Valentino, in which Valentino's Sheik is portrayed differently. But it being a romantic comedy, and that the eponymous Sheik gets the girl in the end, don't worry. We find out that he was actually a secret white the whole time, just like Esmeralda. I should do a video about characters of color and media who were, like, revealed to be secretly white the whole time. We can call it dolezals. Now this was before the Hays Code, so it wasn't yet mandated that the bad man must be punished on screen. But the studio thought that should be the case because early audiences did. We cannot have the bad man, what does the murders, get a sympathetic, tragic ending. And moreover, we cannot have an ethnic be both a central character and heroic, and live. The 1943 version has not one, but two roles who vie for Christine's affections. One is a cop and the other likes to play detective, so they team up to rescue Christine. So they learned to view to well so the way to play to sa although I mean, they don't really have a history with the Phantom, but they kind of serve the purpose of expediting the third act along to its conclusion. Also, this movie it kind of owns, because it ends with Kristen fucking off without either of them. Like, bye. Then, yes, Phantom on ice. The Phantom has, like, a whole chorus of acolytes/groupies that exist. I feel like we don't talk enough about the fact that there was, like, this whole era of human history where Thing on Ice was so ubiquitous it was parodied in an episode of Rugrats. Reptar, you have come back to me. Yes, dear, indeed I have. Speaking of the 90s, possibly the most early 90s thing ever set to film, Phantom of the Mall. Yes, a real movie wherein the Phantom Eric does not torturedly play the organ in his basement, he torturedly lifts. He is not an angel of music. He is an angel of roundhouse kicks. And in this version our Persian is It's Pauly Shore. I promise not to spit in your yogurt. The 1990 movie is starring Charles Dance. That Charles Dance, our Persian replacement, is Eric's dad, played by Burt Lancaster, who hid him away as a babby and raised him to be a they who hey Hello, do, 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 view, view, Phantom of the Opera that punches plastic deer. Oh yeah, let's watch that again. In 1998, Italian filmmaker Dario Argento directed his own adaptation, and the sort of romantic analogy between its Phantom and Persian replacement, and in this one the Phantom is a tortured rapist who is not deformed, and our Persian surrogate is a bunch of rats. Friendly rats. This, for the record, is the worst adaptation of Phantom. It's the worst one. It's bad. But of course the most well-known replacement is Madame Curie in the Andrew Lloyd Webber adaptation, who serves the purpose of filling in the Phantom's backstory after seeing him on his World Freak Tour years prior. There was, I shall never forget him, a man locked in a cage, but being too chicken shit to do anything else after ratting him out to the gilded youth. He lives across the lake, monsieur. This is as far as I dare go. And all of this is to say nothing about adaptations that change their source material so much that there isn't really a Persian surrogate at all, like the 1962 Hammer horror film starring Herbert Lamb, or the only good Phantom of the Opera movie, Brian De Palma's 1974 film, Phantom of the Paradise. I know drug reel from real reel. Of course, the Persian is not absent from 100 of adaptations, even if he is absent from all of the ones you've ever heard of. There was a 1988 animated movie that's one of those like classic literature for kids things from the 80s that had a budget of like 2. You can find the house by the river. Come. And he's also in the terrible 1991 musical that was released on video and sold in all of the stores, and poor fools kept buying it, thinking it was the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, and then being horribly disappointed when they got home. You may follow me into the darkness if you like, Daroge, because for the most part the trend with this character, despite being extremely well liked by fans, has been erasure, because I guess we just don't know what to do with him. But when it's not erasure, are you telling me the girl is transferable? Like the Grand Vizier's signet ring that whoever takes one must take the other. I sighed. It is often the custom in such matters. Oh, I see, he said contemptuously. Legalized rape is the done thing here, is it? Any man may force himself upon a woman and say it is the custom. Well, then we circle back to Orientalism. This is all a prelude to discuss what is debatably the most memorable take on the character outside of the original novel, Susan Kaye's Phantom, and how much it bites hard. Look at this cover. Yeah, this is a reprint. The original was much more like 90s romance novel. Utri being the only girl in the Phantom forums who hated this book in 2001. Anyway, I'm just explaining myself, because a lot of Phantom fans really like this book and it really changed a lot of the foundations of the fandom itself. Most fans even call the Persian by the name Susan Kaye gave him in the book, Nader Khan. So Phantom is basically a 600-page novel about the life of the Phantom, split into 6 different points of view. Nader is the point of view character for Eric's 20s, which he set squarely in Iran, then Persia, starting in the year 1850. So let's take a look at Persia in 1850. Nasser-ul-Din Shah was the actual real-life Shah, newly in his reign, and this book paints him as an ineffectual, bloodthirsty, backwards tyrant. You know, Iran didn't have great luck with Shahs for the last 200-ish years of them. But on the real, Nasser-ul-Din Shah was a mixed personality whose reign is marked by the constant sturm and drang about modernizing Persia by Western standards. And in absolute fairness, the Shah of Persia at the time was what academic historians describe as a effing weirdo. During research for this, we learned about a game he'd play with his wives and children called Lights Out, where he'd just like turn the lights off and everyone in the room would just have to beat the shit out of each other in total darkness. Monarchs. But he did like jerk off using the blood of virgins and assassinate half of his court as he does in this book. And this is another way that the book really influenced the fandom, by playing into these ugly 19th century Orientalist tropes. We have to make Eric backstory all harsh and tragic, and part of that is painting Persia as this cutthroat awful place, with stuff like corruption and executions and slavery. So much slavery, which was nothing like the US in the 1850s. LaRue's original novel frames Eric against a world that is horrible, that everywhere he went molded him into the nightmare fuckboy he turned into. It is the same sort of like Ender's Game logic, where it's like, I know you have a kind and gentle heart, but you're just so good at murder. In a better world or hell, If he had just been normal looking, he would have been a respectable man. In fact, that is how the original novel ends, Larue lamenting how terrible the world is to disadvantaged people, and positing that Eric could have been one of the world's great minds if the world wasn't so shitty to people with disabilities. Which for 1910 is a pretty nuanced take. Hell, for now it's a nuanced take. Eric looked like a monster, so people treated him like one, and he behaved like one in kind, but he was not born a monster. But while Susan Kay does not drop that angle, the entire Persia sequence is framed as different from all of the other locations, which are set in France and Italy. It was Persia that really made him into a monster, because the culture is just that bad. So after all this, you might be asking yourself what the point of this video was. Was it really just an elaborate excuse to talk about Phantom of the Opera for half an hour and dump on this book? Yes. But while we rehear, I don't mean to imply that Gaston Leroux was intentionally trying to write the wokest book ever featuring a non-Western character. But I don't think it was unintentional that he went out of his way to place a Persian character as basically the moral backbone of his story in a market that basically demanded white heroes and relegated everybody else to stereotype, spectacle, or both. Fundamentally, Orientalist media and the stereotypes it creates, even what we see as benign or even benevolent, are a kind of erasure, a simplified refutation of the realities of a lot of people. But it is erasure that serves a socio-political purpose as well. And I think it's interesting that with this character, we effectively had nothing but erasure all the way up to the late 1980s. And once the Persian was reintroduced back into Phantom fandom through Kay's novel, in a lot of ways it was a lot more regressive than Leroux's original novel was, and fans were keen to embrace the more Orientalist tropes, effectively replacing erasure with Orientalism. I was in those forums 20 years ago too, and while I never liked this book, I can't say I did not uncritically enjoy some of those Orientalist elements extracted both from the book and from the original novel. And Phantom of the Opera is far, far from the only modern example where this is a thing. This isn't to say you're a bad person if that angle appealed to you, but rather I would like to encourage you to critically think about why that angle appealed to people. Why do so much of old Western media be like that? Why do so much of it still be like that? And recognize that there are some very real consequences to Orientalism in media, even from ignorant racists painting sex slaves in the 19th century. But I also wonder, could there be an adaptation of Phantom of the Opera that keeps the character of the Persian and this idea of Eric living in Persia for a while as a part of his backstory without incorporating those ugly Orientalist tropes? The world has changed a lot in the 110 years since Phantom of the Opera was published, but for all of its pulpiness and ham-fisted Edwardian melodrama, it still keeps getting remade and re-enters the conversation. But the consistent erasure of one of its main characters is a testament to how little the needle has nudged in this one regard. And while we rehear, part of the reason I kept putting off releasing this video was because of escalating tension between the Pes and Iran, and given that this whole episode concerns an Iranian character, I wasn't sure how or even if I should address them. And even now we still don't know what's going to happen or how this is going to play out, but I will say this. In times of stress, there is a tendency to fall back on narratives that feel familiar. And if we keep seeing narratives of a certain people being othered enough, eventually makes sense to start conflict with these people, even if there's no benefit to either side in doing so, save perhaps the political. So I wonder if it is possible to challenge ourselves to evolve past these narratives which have already caused so much harm. But again, maybe that's just human nature. And with that, now I have to do me ad read. I, of course, was going to recommend some version of Phantom of the Opera, but instead I'll recommend the book that I'm listening to right now, which is Ronan Farrow's War on Peace, The End of Diplomacy, and the Decline of American Influence. Hey, speaking of iron, and to help motivate you, Audible is issuing a challenge to current and new members. Finish 3 audiobooks by March 3rd and get a $20 Amazon credit. Yeah, I'm almost done with my 3. $20, here I come. Finish 3x33 and get $20. Visit audible.com/Lindsay Ellis or text Lindsay Ellis to 500-500. Start listening with a 30-day trial and choose one audiobook and 2 Audible originals absolutely free. Listen on any device, anytime, anywhere, at home, at the gym, on your commute, or on your way to the anti-war protest. You also enjoy easy exchanges for any audiobook you don't love and an audiobook library you keep forever, even if you cancel or if we go to war with iron. Visit audible.com/Lindsay Ellis or text Lindsay Ellis to 500-500. So get started with your free trial. That was awkward. Okie dokie, here's me reading some quotes about slavery. Why risk offending the Shah for the sake of a girl who is only a slave? He gave a great cry of rage, lifted the table in front of him, and threw it across the room with a force that splintered the legs asunder from the marble top. Only a slave. Only an animal. You asinine Persian dolt, he roared. Get out of me way quickly before I forget all that I owe you. I am fed up with this world. I raised me shoulders helplessly. The Shah's sister is his personal property to be disposed of as he sees fit. Eric looked at me incredulously. Are you telling me the girl is transferable? Well, the Grand Vizier's signet ring. Whoever takes one must take the other. I sighed. It is often the custom in such matters. Oh, I see. Legalized rape is just a done thing here, is it? He said contemptuously. Any man may force himself in and say it's the custom. My God, what country! And he turned away with such fierce disgust that I felt faintly ashamed of my own race.